Amelia Madison walked into the private banking branch to close a quiet acquisition, never noticing three men had followed her from the parking structure since dawn. When the barrel pressed against her side, every customer in the lobby dropped to the floor, trembling. At the back of the line stood Mason Carter, a single father in a worn jacket, motionless, his eyes calm and unreadable. The gunman assumed he was simply
Mở tài
another
khoản ngay.
frightened stranger,
Được
too
rồi,
poor to matter.
nhưng hãy bình tĩnh.
They had no idea the
Đừng trì
quiet man
hoãn.
behind them
Bây
had
giờ.
survived operations the government still refused to admit
Nằm
happened,
im,
buried
đừng cử
in
động.
shadows.
Mày, đưa tay
Stay
ra
with
sau
this
đầu,
story
đừng bắn,
because
tôi nghe lời
Mason's
anh.
next
Làm ơn
quiet
giữ
move
lại.
will
Im
leave the
mồm,
entire
không ai
bank
cứu cô.
holding its breath
Vâng, tôi sẽ
until the
làm.
end.
Giữ tay lên, không
Chicago
ai chạy.
woke that morning
Mở
under
cửa
a
ngay,
low gray
hoặc tôi
sky,
bắn.
rain
Được rồi,
sliding
tôi
down
mở.
the glass
Đừng làm
towers
hai
of
cô
the
ấy.
financial
Làm
district
ơn đừng
and
bắn.
cooling along
Nhanh lên,
curbs
mật
where
khẩu.
a single
Tôi
black
đang nhập
sedan
đây.
idled
Nếu anh
outside
làm
a
gì ngu
private
ngốc,
banking
cô ấy chết.
Cứu tôi
Inside
với.
that branch, marble floors caught the reflection of overhead lights, and the hush of old money filled every corner. It was the kind of morning where nothing seemed unusual, which was exactly why nobody noticed the danger walking through the front doors. Amelia Madison arrived first, moving with the practiced calm of a woman used to being watched. She was the chief executive of a rising medical technology company, and beneath her composed exterior, she carried the weight of a deal that could either save her firm or destroy it. She was there to finalize a confidential acquisition, one that required absolute discretion, which was why she had come with only a single assistant waiting outside and a folder of encrypted documents pressed against her side. She did not want reporters, she did not want questions, and she certainly did not want anyone to know how close her company stood to collapse. Mason Carter walked in a few minutes later, and he could not have looked more different from her. His jacket was worn at the elbows, his boots scuffed from years of use, and his posture suggested a man who wanted nothing more than to be forgotten in a crowd. He was there for something ordinary, finishing paperwork tied to a small savings account he had built quietly for his family. Nothing about him hinted at anything beyond the surface. He was, by every visible measure, an unremarkable man standing in a line of unremarkable people. What no one in that lobby knew was that Mason had spent years living a different life entirely, one built around silence and discipline, the kind of life that leaves a person changed long after the mission's end. These days he worked quietly repairing security systems for small businesses, keeping his past folded away where no one could reach it. He had a daughter at home who mattered more to him than anything else in the world, and that alone was reason enough to stay invisible, to avoid the kind of attention that might unravel the peace he had built for her. Amelia passed him without a second glance, her mind already occupied with the numbers waiting in the back office. To her, he was simply another customer, forgettable and small, but Mason noticed things most people never would. He noticed a man standing too close to the emergency exit, another whose eyes kept drifting toward the security camera in the corner, and a gym bag set down in a spot that made no sense for someone waiting to deposit a check. He did not react. He rarely did. Instead, he watched, the way he had been trained to watch long ago, cataloging details without letting his face betray a single thought. His breathing stayed even, his shoulders stayed loose, and his eyes moved only when necessary. It was a discipline built from years of learning that the moment you show your hand is the moment you lose control of the room. Then the door opened once more, and a man in a dark coat stepped through with unnatural calm, one hand gripping a bag, the other never leaving the inside of his jacket. Mason's eyes settled on him instantly, and something in his chest went still and sharp, the particular stillness of a man who has just recognized the shape of danger before anyone else in the room even understood it existed. The branch manager, a courteous man named Lucas David, guided Amelia toward a private room reserved for high-value transactions. She thanked him briskly and asked that everything move quickly, since her board was waiting on confirmation that the escrow transfer had gone through. Time mattered more than comfort that morning, and she made no effort to hide her impatience. Out in the lobby, Mason remained in line, his expression unreadable, his mind quietly mapping the room. He noted the position of each camera, the location of the lone security guard near the entrance, the emergency exits at both ends of the building, and the small fire alarm panel tucked behind the front desk. None of it seemed urgent yet, but old instincts rarely stayed silent once triggered. The man in the dark coat, later known to the room as Connor Logan, exchanged a glance with two others who had entered separately, blending into the crowd so well that no one had connected them until now. One drew the exterior blinds shut with practiced ease. Another moved closer to the security guard, positioning himself just out of the man's peripheral vision. Mason recognized the pattern immediately. These were not desperate amateurs looking for a quick score. They had entered during a shift change, exploiting the exact minutes when coverage thinned, and they seemed to know precisely where Amelia was seated. That kind of precision did not belong to random opportunists. It suggested planning, patience, and a target far more specific than the vault itself. A pen slipped from a teller's hand and clattered against the counter. The sound was small, almost nothing, yet one of the armed men flinched toward it with a speed that revealed a weapon hidden beneath his jacket. Mason's eyes tracked the motion without turning his head, confirming what he already suspected. He could have moved right then. He had the skill, the timing, and the years of experience required to end things before they escalated. But the room was full of civilians who had no idea what was unfolding around them, and acting too soon risked turning a controlled situation into chaos. So he waited, patient in a way that looked, to anyone watching, like simple stillness. Inside the private room, the lights flickered once, then steadied. Amelia glanced up, uneasy, without knowing why. Outside, her assistant Grace Catherine sent a message warning that a dark sedan had been parked across the street far longer than seemed normal. Amelia never got the chance to respond. The moment shattered when Connor stepped forward, drew the blinds fully closed, and fired a single round into the ceiling. Plaster rained down as the room dissolved into screams, bodies dropping to the floor in a wave of instinctive fear. Connor's eyes swept the room until they landed on the private office where Amelia had disappeared moments earlier. He said her name aloud, calm and certain, proving beyond any doubt that she had never been a random target at all. Mason lay flat against the cold marble with the rest of the customers, his cheek nearly touching the floor, yet his eyes stayed open just enough to track boots moving across the room. He counted footsteps, measured distances, and noted which of the three men carried himself like someone who had trained for this, and which one looked as though the weight of the gun in his hand still felt foreign and heavy. That kind of information, gathered quietly in the space of a few seconds, would matter more than anyone in that room could have guessed. Somewhere above the chaos, a single working security camera kept recording, its lens catching every movement in grainy, unblinking detail. None of the men glanced up to check it, certain they had already disabled every recording system in the building. Their confidence would prove to be the first crack in an otherwise carefully built plan. Connor announced that this was a robbery, ordering everyone to surrender their phones and remain flat on the ground. Yet his focus never truly settled on the vault. His eyes kept returning to Amelia, and it was clear within seconds that she was the reason he had come at all. Amelia tried to steady herself, falling back on the composed authority that had carried her through countless boardrooms. She attempted to negotiate, but Connor knocked the folder from her hands and told her plainly that he knew exactly why she had come to that branch, and exactly which account she intended to access. Mason stayed down among the other hostages, his expression hidden, his gaze low and controlled. He resisted every instinct urging him to act, understanding that a single mistake in a room this crowded could cost an innocent life. Heroism, in moments like these, often looked indistinguishable from patience. One of the gunmen moved through the room collecting phones, eventually stopping near Mason. Something about his stillness seemed to catch the man's attention, but a glance at his worn jacket and tired posture was enough to dismiss him as harmless. Mason let the assumption stand, deliberately softening his shoulders, slowing his breath, and keeping his dominant hand tucked beneath his body where it would not be noticed. Amelia was pulled to the center of the lobby, a gun pressed against her temple as Connor demanded she unlock access to her company's corporate accounts. It became clear to her in that moment that this was never only about the money sitting in the bank. Connor wanted control over the acquisition itself, and he seemed to possess details that only someone deeply embedded in her organization could have known. He mentioned internal figures, timelines, and safeguards that belonged to conversations held only among her most trusted staff. Amelia's stomach tightened as she realized the truth creeping toward her, though she said nothing, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of watching her unravel. Outside, police units began sealing off the surrounding streets after a silent alarm triggered somewhere inside the building. Ryan Joseph, the officer placed in command of the scene, worked quickly to determine how many hostages remained trapped inside, frustrated by the lack of clear visibility into the lobby. Back inside, a young bank employee near the counter began to panic, his hands shaking so badly that his keys nearly slipped from his grip. Mason caught his eye for the briefest moment, offering a small, steady look meant only to calm him, careful not to draw any attention from the men holding the room hostage. Connor finally pulled Amelia to her feet and began walking her toward the corridor leading to the secure vault. Mason shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, rolling one shoulder, quietly preparing his body to move the instant the right opportunity presented itself. He watched the two remaining gunmen divide their attention between the hostages and the corridor, noting how one kept glancing toward the front doors as though expecting trouble from outside rather than within. That habit, small as it seemed, told Mason which man would be easier to surprise and which one would require more caution. He filed the observation away the same way he had filed 1,000 others over the years, never assuming a detail was useless until proven otherwise. The lobby had gone eerily quiet except for the occasional muffled sob from someone pressed against the marble floor. Mason let his eyes drift toward the ceiling for half a second, confirming the position of the one camera still recording, the same one the gunman had failed to disable. If anyone ever needed proof of what unfolded inside that bank, it would exist whether Connor and his men realized it or not. Connor split his men into precise roles, leaving one to guard the lobby, while another forced Lucas David to open the corridor leading toward the vault, all while he kept Amelia close, using her as a shield against anything unexpected. Mason measured the distance between himself and the nearest gunman, understanding that acting too soon would only place both remaining hostages closer to danger. He noticed a high-angle camera still active despite the men's certainty that every system had been disabled. Using the polished stone floor as a faint mirror, Mason tracked movement behind him without ever lifting his head, a trick learned long ago in rooms far more hostile than this one. An older woman nearby began struggling to breathe, overwhelmed by fear. The gunman guarding the lobby snapped at her to stay silent. Mason spoke quietly, asking permission for her to sit upright so she could catch her breath. The gunman, irritated, stepped forward and kicked Mason hard enough to knock the air from his lungs, mistaking his calm request for weakness. Mason absorbed the blow without resistance, giving nothing away. Amelia witnessed the exchange from where she stood and found herself studying the stranger more closely. There was something in the way he endured the strike, something that suggested restraint rather than fear, and it unsettled her in a way she could not yet explain. Connor forced Amelia toward the authentication terminal, demanding she enter her credentials. She stalled, claiming the system required confirmation from her corporate servers first. His patience thinned quickly, and he revealed that he already knew about the backup servers housed inside the bank's own infrastructure, information that should have existed only among her most senior security staff. The realization hit Amelia like cold water. Someone close to her, someone trusted, had handed this information to a stranger holding a gun to her head. Mason overheard enough of the exchange to understand that this was no impulsive crime. Someone had planned this with inside knowledge, someone who knew the architecture of her company as intimately as she did. Quietly, without drawing attention, Mason worked a small metal fragment free from his belt buckle, palming it and pressing it flat against his hand, preparing a tool from an object no one would think to search. The gunman guarding the lobby finally turned his back, distracted by a noise near the entrance. For most people, 3 seconds would have meant nothing at all. For Mason, 3 seconds was more than enough time to change everything that happened next. He had spent years learning that most confrontations were decided long before the first move was made, in the quiet calculations that happened behind a still face and steady breath. He thought of his daughter only for an instant, a flicker of motivation rather than distraction, a reminder of exactly why he could not allow this room to end in tragedy. Then the thought passed, and only the mission remained. Behind the vault door, Connor grew impatient with the delay, unaware that the man he had dismissed as harmless was no longer lying passively on the floor. Every second that ticked by now belonged to Mason, and he intended to use every one of them. He rose without sound, moving low along the counter line where the security camera's angle could not catch his silhouette. His years of training had taught him that speed mattered less than certainty, that a single controlled movement carried more weight than a dozen rushed ones. The remaining hostages nearby barely registered his shift in position, their eyes fixed on the floor, too afraid to look up and notice the quiet transformation taking place only a few feet away from them. Mason moved without noise, refusing to turn this into a loud confrontation that might endanger the hostages around him. He nudged a desk phone off its cradle just enough to catch the working camera's angle, then used his foot to slide an employee badge closer to where he crouched, gathering tools from the smallest, most overlooked details in the room. He tipped over a half-full glass of water near the gunman guarding the lobby, letting it spread into a thin, slick sheen across the marble. When the man bent to retrieve a fallen bag moments later, Mason moved in a single fluid motion, locking the man's wrist, muffling his mouth, and pulling him behind the teller counter before anyone could register what had happened. The entire exchange lasted only seconds, quiet enough that none of the terrified hostages nearby fully understood what had occurred. Mason took the man's radio but left the weapon untouched for now, aware that the sound of a round being chambered could easily draw Connor's attention from the vault corridor. He signaled gently to a few nearby hostages with nothing more than a steady glance, urging them silently to remain still and trust that help was already unfolding around them, even if they could not yet see it. Outside, Ryan Joseph noticed unusual movement on the one working camera feed, watching as one of the armed men suddenly vanished from view without explanation. He zoomed in, catching a brief glimpse of Mason's face before the image blurred again. and something in his gut told him this was not an ordinary bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Inside the vault corridor, Connor pressed Amelia toward the biometric scanner, demanding she complete the authentication process. Amelia stalled again, insisting the system required a secondary confirmation step that did not actually exist, buying herself precious minutes while her mind raced for any possible way out. Connor tried reaching his lobby guard through the radio, met only with silence. Mason, holding the same radio now, mimicked the static hiss of interference, delaying the moment Connor would realize something had gone terribly wrong with his plan. The tension inside the vault corridor thickened as Connor's suspicion deepened by the second, his eyes darting toward the corridor entrance more frequently, his grip on Amelia tightening in response to his rising unease. Mason understood. The clock was working against him now. If Connor managed to pull Amelia deeper into the vault chamber, any rescue attempt would grow exponentially more difficult, the walls themselves becoming another obstacle standing between her and safety. He finally picked up the fallen weapon, but instead of arming it, he pulled the magazine free entirely, transforming it into a tool of distraction rather than a means of further violence, precisely the kind of restraint that had defined every decision he had made since stepping into that bank. He crouched low behind the counter, running through the layout of the building in his mind, weighing every corridor and blind corner against the small amount of information he had gathered so far. The bank was not large, but under these circumstances, every hallway felt like its own battlefield, and every closed door represented a decision that could not be undone once made. The bound gunman stirred faintly behind the counter, and Mason pressed a firm, steady hand against his shoulder, a silent warning that required no words to be understood. There would be no second chances offered tonight, not while two lives still hung in the balance only a short distance away. Connor forced Lucas David to unlock the secondary vault door, the one housing the bank's special transaction authentication hardware. Amelia asked how he possibly knew she needed to finalize her escrow transfer that exact day, and Connor smiled coldly, telling her that someone close to her had sold her out completely. Amelia's mind went immediately to Hunter Wyatt, her company's head of internal security, a man who had opposed the acquisition from the very beginning and never hid his frustration about being excluded from the final negotiations. The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Connor wanted Amelia to redirect funds into a hidden account while simultaneously seizing a data drive that reportedly contained evidence of stock manipulation tied directly to Hunter. If the plan succeeded, Amelia herself would be blamed for embezzlement during a robbery that appeared, on the surface, entirely random. In the main lobby, Mason used the captured employee badge to slip through a side door leading into a narrow service corridor. He found a fire safety diagram mounted on the wall and discovered a technical access path connecting directly to the vault chamber, one clearly not intended for public use. Unable to call the police directly without risking discovery, Mason relied on an indirect signal instead. He triggered a fire alarm sensor in an unoccupied section of the building, forcing the automated system to release several emergency locks along the corridor, doors that would otherwise have remained sealed throughout the standoff. Ryan Joseph noticed the alarm activation and immediately recognized it as no accident. Something about the timing, the specific section it targeted, told him someone inside the building was working quietly to help law enforcement without exposing themselves to unnecessary risk. Outside, Grace Catherine forwarded Amelia's final message to police, along with an urgent note explaining that Hunter Wyatt had vanished from company headquarters the very moment the robbery began, a detail far too coincidental to ignore. That single observation confirmed what everyone had begun to suspect, but no one had yet said aloud. Mason crept closer to the vault entrance, listening carefully as Connor counted down the remaining minutes to Amelia, his patience clearly beginning to fracture under the pressure of a plan that was slipping further from his control with every passing second. Inside the vault chamber, Amelia caught the faint outline of a reflection sliding across the polished steel door, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she understood with quiet certainty that she was no longer facing this nightmare entirely alone. Lucas David stood frozen near the far wall, watching Connor's fingers hover over the transaction terminal, his own hands trembling from a fear he had never once expected to feel inside a building he had managed for over a decade. He had seen this vault as a symbol of security his entire career, and now it felt like nothing more than a cage closing tighter around everyone trapped inside it. Connor barked another order toward the corridor, expecting a response from his lobby guard that never came. His confidence, so unshakable only minutes earlier, had begun to show its first visible cracks. Cracks that Mason intended to widen with every quiet step he took closer to the vault entrance. Amelia forced herself to breathe evenly, refusing to let panic seize control of her thinking. She had built a career on staying calm under pressure, and even now, with a gun inches from her. Some part of her refused to accept that this was how everything would end. Connor pulled Amelia tightly against his chest, using her as a human shield while the second gunman stood near Lucas, his weapon trembling but still pointed squarely at the hostages. Mason could not risk a direct shot, and the narrow confines of the vault corridor left almost no room for a straightforward approach. He triggered the fire suppression misting system instead, filling the chamber with a fine, disorienting spray that dramatically reduced visibility within seconds. Connor panicked but refused to release Amelia, gripping her even tighter as confusion spread through the vault. Mason used the sudden echo of metal striking metal to redirect the second gunman's attention toward the wrong side of the room entirely. The gunman spun in the mistaken direction, giving Mason the narrow opening he needed. He closed the distance in an instant, disabling the man with a swift, silent joint lock that dropped him to the floor before a single shot could be fired. Connor, realizing someone else had entered the chamber, shouted for whoever it was to step forward immediately. Mason emerged through the mist with both hands raised, weaponless, appearing for all the world like a man surrendering completely. Connor recognized him instantly as the poor, forgettable customer from earlier and mocked him openly, calling him foolish for wandering into a situation so far beyond his understanding. Mason said very little in response, simply asking Connor to release Amelia and take him as a replacement hostage instead. What Connor failed to notice was that Mason had positioned himself precisely where the working exterior camera could capture a clear, unobstructed view of his hands, ensuring there would be no ambiguity later about who had been holding a weapon and who had not. Outside, Ryan Joseph ordered his tactical team to hold their positions, sensing that Mason was working through some careful plan of his own rather than simply attempting a desperate act of bravery. Amelia listened to Mason's voice, steady and unshaken despite the chaos surrounding them, and recognized something in his tone that reminded her, unmistakably, of people who had truly lived through combat rather than simply imagined it. Mason pushed further, needling Connor by pointing out that he was nothing more than a pawn being used by Hunter Wyatt, a remark clearly designed to provoke him into losing what little composure remained. Connor's anger flared exactly as intended, and he shoved the gun closer to Mason's face. Mason waited for the precise instant Connor's finger drifted from the trigger, then seized his wrist, twisted his body, and pulled Amelia clear of the weapon's path in one continuous, decisive motion. The mist still hung thick in the air, catching what little light remained before the chamber finally went dark, and for a fraction of a second Mason's world narrowed entirely to the feel of Amelia's arm beneath his grip and the certainty that he needed to pull her away no matter the cost. Years of training had taught him that hesitation in moments like this one caused more harm than any bullet ever could, and he trusted that training completely, even as chaos closed in around them. Connor struggled against him, refusing to release his weapon even as his balance failed and his footing slipped against the misted floor. Mason kept his hold firm, refusing to let the fight slow down or lose its rhythm, aware that a single mistake now could undo everything he had carefully built toward over the past several minutes. A gunshot rang out through the chamber as every light in the vault suddenly died, plunging the room into total darkness, and for one long suspended moment, no one could say for certain who among them had been struck. Emergency lighting flared to life, bathing the vault chamber in a dim red glow. Amelia found herself on the floor, unharmed, having been pulled behind the thick steel door just moments before the shot rang out. Mason had taken the impact instead, a bullet grazing his shoulder, leaving a wound painful enough to sting but not severe enough to slow him down. Connor, disarmed but still desperate, escaped through a side exit using a small smoke device he had kept hidden for exactly this kind of emergency. Mason chose not to chase him immediately, prioritizing the safety of Amelia and Lucas over the pursuit of a man who could still be caught later. Amelia noticed the blood soaking through Mason's sleeve and asked, almost breathless, who he really was. Mason offered only a brief answer, telling her that he had once done work that never appeared on any official record. The vagueness of his response only deepened her curiosity rather than settling it. Outside the building, Ryan Joseph finally received a clearer image from the working camera feed, one that captured the full extent of Mason's movements, the precision with which he disarmed the fallen gunman, and the deliberate way he had shielded every hostage around him. It was immediately obvious that this was no ordinary bystander reacting out of instinct. Ryan placed an urgent call to a federal contact, requesting confirmation on the identity of a man named Mason Carter. The response came back brief but unmistakable, confirming a restricted file, prior service in a specialized unit, and details that remained permanently classified from public record. Meanwhile, Grace Catherine discovered evidence that Hunter Wyatt had accessed Amelia's private schedule and forwarded sensitive details to an untraceable burner number just hours before the robbery began. The timing left no room for innocent explanation. Hunter himself lingered near the police perimeter outside, pretending to offer assistance to law enforcement while secretly waiting for Connor to deliver the stolen data drive he needed so desperately. Inside the vault chamber, Connor attempted to contact Hunter through a hidden earpiece, unaware that fragments of the conversation were being picked up by Mason, who had recovered the discarded radio moments earlier. Mason understood immediately that the true danger had not been contained within the vault at all. It waited just outside the police barricade, disguised as a concerned bystander eager to help. Connor reappeared in the main lobby moments later, seizing additional hostages and demanding a vehicle be prepared for his escape, forcing the police outside to shift their entire strategy in response to his sudden reappearance. Amelia pressed a hand against Mason's wounded shoulder, trying to slow the bleeding as best she could, her earlier composure giving way to something rawer and more human. She had spent years perfecting the art of appearing untouchable, and yet here she was, kneeling on a marble floor beside a stranger who had just taken a bullet meant for her. Lucas David remained crouched nearby, still shaking, whispering that he had worked at that branch for over a decade and had never imagined a morning like this one. Mason offered him a brief nod of reassurance, more concerned with the sound of Connor's retreating footsteps than with his own injury. Somewhere beyond the vault, sirens grew louder, layering over the tense silence that had settled inside the building, a silence broken only by Amelia's unsteady breathing, and Mason's own quiet calculations about what still needed to happen before this could truly end. Connor declared that, unless a vehicle arrived within 10 minutes, he would kill Amelia in full view of the cameras outside. Amelia considered stepping forward to buy time, but Mason stopped her, warning that Connor wanted exactly that, a dramatic image that would help frame her as the villain behind the entire disaster. Mason explained quickly, without wasting words, that if Amelia died or was forced to transfer funds under duress, Hunter would walk away with the money, the incriminating data, and a narrative perfectly designed to destroy her reputation beyond repair. For the first time since the ordeal began, Amelia dropped the composed executive mask she had worn her entire career, admitting quietly that she had trusted her own systems and her own people far more than she probably should have. Mason offered no lengthy comfort in return. He simply told her that every system, no matter how carefully built, contained blind spots, but a clear-headed person could still find a way to correct them before it was too late. The simplicity of his words settled something in her that hours of reassurance from anyone else might never have reached. Ryan Joseph attempted to open a dialogue with Connor through the building's loudspeaker system, hoping to stall for additional time while his team repositioned outside. Mason made his way back toward the lobby through the same narrow service corridor, though his injured shoulder slowed his progress considerably more than he wanted to admit. Amelia made a decision of her own, using her executive access remotely to freeze the escrow account entirely, stripping away the very reward Connor had been counting on from the very beginning. Connor discovered the frozen transaction almost immediately and erupted in fury, realizing his carefully built plan was unraveling faster than he could control. Outside the perimeter, Hunter grew visibly anxious as well, understanding that his scheme to frame Amelia was collapsing right alongside Connor's failing operation. Grace quietly passed every piece of evidence she had gathered directly to Ryan, ensuring nothing would be lost or overlooked in the confusion of the unfolding standoff. Hunter attempted to slip away from the scene entirely, blending into the crowd of onlookers gathered near the police barricade, but Ryan issued an immediate order to detain him for questioning before he could disappear. Inside the bank, Mason pressed forward despite the throbbing pain in his shoulder, each step a reminder of how close the morning had come to ending in tragedy. He thought briefly of the ordinary life he had built for himself, the quiet mornings, the small routines, and how quickly all of it could vanish if he allowed himself even a moment of carelessness now. Amelia watched him move through the dim corridor and realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that her survival did not depend on her title, her wealth, or her position at the head of a boardroom table. It depended entirely on the quiet, steady resolve of a man the world had spent his entire life underestimating. Ryan's officers began tightening their formation outside, aware that whatever happened next inside that lobby would likely determine how this entire ordeal came to a close, one way or another, within the next several minutes. Connor dragged Amelia into the main lobby, holding her in front of him like a shield, shouting demands for the doors to be opened immediately. Rain battered the tall glass windows outside, red and blue emergency lights sweeping across the interior of the bank in slow, rhythmic waves that made the entire scene feel like something out of a film rather than real life. Mason stayed hidden behind the teller counter, aware that he likely had only one true opportunity left to end this safely. He had watched Connor closely enough by now to recognize a small, telling habit: the way his eyes flicked left before every sudden movement, a pattern shaped by nerves rather than training. Mason hurled a discarded bag of cash in the opposite direction, and Connor's eyes darted toward the sound exactly as expected, distracted for just a fraction of a second. Amelia understood immediately what that motion meant and lowered her body weight the instant she felt the shift in his grip. Mason moved then, not with brute force but with a precise, practiced sequence of motion, pulling Amelia clear of danger, locking Connor's shoulder, and slamming his weapon hand hard against the edge of the counter. The gun clattered to the floor, though Connor still managed to draw a hidden blade in desperation. Mason absorbed a shallow cut along his forearm but maintained control of the fight, refusing to surrender the advantage he had worked so carefully to build. Connor snarled that Mason was nothing more than a poor father who had no business interfering in matters involving people far wealthier and more powerful than himself. Mason's response was calm and unwavering. He told Connor plainly that a human life carried no price tag and belonged to no particular class of person. The words landed with a quiet, devastating weight, becoming the emotional center of the entire confrontation. Police finally burst through the entrance just as Mason pinned Connor firmly to the ground, ending the standoff that had gripped the bank for what felt like an eternity to everyone trapped inside. Amelia sank down onto the cold marble floor, trembling but alive, staring at Mason as though seeing an entirely different person than the quiet stranger she had dismissed earlier that same morning. Ryan Joseph approached slowly through the chaos, addressing Mason by a rank he had not used publicly in years, a single sentence that left the entire lobby completely silent. For a moment nobody moved. The rain kept falling outside, streaking down the tall windows, and the flashing emergency lights kept sweeping across the marble floor as though the building itself needed time to absorb what had just happened within its walls. Officers moved quickly to secure Connor, while paramedics rushed toward Mason and Amelia, though Mason waved off immediate attention until he was certain every hostage had been accounted for. Lucas David stood near the vault corridor, still shaking, watching the man he had assumed was simply another anxious customer being treated, instead like someone who had just saved every life inside that building. He would later tell colleagues that he had never seen anything like it, and he never quite found the right words to describe what he meant. Amelia remained seated on the floor a moment longer, unwilling to move until her breathing steadied and her hands stopped trembling, her eyes never leaving Mason as the full weight of the morning settled over her. Connor was taken into custody along with the remaining member of his crew, and every hostage inside the bank was finally led out into the cold morning rain, safe at last after an ordeal that had stretched far longer than anyone inside had realized. Hunter Wyatt was detained once officers discovered a communication device tuned to the exact same frequency Connor had used throughout the robbery, a discovery that erased any doubt about his involvement in the entire scheme. Grace handed over every piece of evidence she had gathered: the leaked schedule, the hidden transfers, the encrypted messages, and the outline of a plan clearly designed to place the blame squarely on Amelia's shoulders. Amelia emerged from the ordeal with her company intact, though the shock of the morning forced her to reconsider the way she had been running her organization for years. She realized that placing too much faith in systems and trusted titles had nearly allowed her downfall to be engineered by someone she had never suspected. Mason declined every request for an interview, avoiding reporters entirely, wanting nothing more than to leave the bank quietly and return to the life he had built long before that morning ever began. Amelia followed him out onto the rain-soaked steps outside the building, thanking him not only for saving her life, but for helping her see a truth she had been too distracted to notice on her own. Mason told her simply that he had not saved a chief executive that day. He had saved a person who was being used as a pawn in someone else's plan, and that distinction mattered more to him than any title ever could. When Amelia asked why he had risked everything for a stranger who meant nothing to him personally, Mason answered quietly that he was a father, and a father could never stand by while an innocent person was pulled into danger right in front of him. He offered no further explanation, keeping the deeper reasons behind his resolve folded away exactly where they had always lived, private and unspoken. Amelia offered him a prominent position as her company's new head of security, but Mason turned down the title, choosing instead to help quietly redesign protections for the employees, patients, and sensitive data the organization depended on every single day. Weeks later, Hunter faced formal charges. The acquisition was completed with full transparency, and Amelia transformed the new security program into a defining standard of integrity across her entire organization. Mason continued living quietly, though he was no longer overlooked the way he once had been, no longer mistaken for someone without purpose or presence. In the final moment, Amelia watched through the glass of a conference room as Mason stepped out of the building in his same worn jacket, moving calmly through the crowded street outside. She understood in that instant that the most dangerous person inside that bank that morning had never been the one holding a weapon, but the one who never needed to prove his strength at all. The story closed on a note of quiet healing rather than dramatic declaration, leaving open the possibility that Amelia and Mason might slowly build something meaningful together, grounded in trust, mutual respect, and the wounds they had both managed to survive. What happened inside that Chicago bank was never really about a robbery. It was about a quiet man the world had learned to overlook, a father who carried a past no one could see, standing between danger and people who never even knew his name. Mason Carter did not choose to be a hero that morning. He chose to protect life, calmly and without hesitation, the same way he had chosen to protect his own family every single day before it. Sometimes the person sitting quietly beside you, dismissed and underestimated, is carrying more strength than anyone around them could ever imagine. If this story moved you, carry its message forward, because the world needs more people willing to stand still when everyone else looks away.